Welcome back, all my crime-loving enthusiasts. Are you ready for today's tale? Well, sit back and buckle up, because it's gonna be a dark one. Today we're discussing the unfortunate passing of a sweet housewife and her lovely dog. Was her life taken, as her husband said, by intruders? Or is there something much more sinister at play? At 5 a.m., a call comes into the emergency dispatch center in Hanahan, South Carolina. On the line is 37-year-old Matthew Speck. His voice is shaky. He's breathing heavily. He tells the dispatcher that two intruders broke into his home in the upscale Eagle Landing neighborhood. According to Matthew, they attacked him and his wife while they were sleeping, and he claims he's been hurt. When the patrol units arrive, dawn hasn't yet broken. The area is still cloaked in darkness. Officers secure the perimeter. The front doors are locked. The windows are intact. There's no obvious signs of forced entry inside the house. Everything seems untouched until they reach the second floor. In one of the bedrooms, officers discover 33-year-old Caitlin Speck lying on the bed. She's unresponsive. At the foot of the bed, on a rug she often napped on, is the family's golden Labrador, Bailey May. She's also dead on arrival. Matthew greets officers with blood on his clothes. There are fresh cuts on his forearms and stomach. As investigators comb through the home, they start to notice things that don't quite add up. All of his electronics, wallets, purses, and jewelry remain untouched. Nothing's been ransacked. There's no drawers open. There's absolutely no signs of a frantic search for valuables. The house is neat, except for the bedroom where the tragedy unfolded. To understand what really happened that morning, we have to go back 12 years to the story's beginning in 2008, when Caitlin met Matthew at a community event. Caitlin was born August 18th, 1986, and was working from home as a designer at the time of that 2020 incident. Her career allowed her to spend most of her time in Hanahan, in a 2-story house nestled in the quiet streets of the amazing Eagle Landing neighborhood. Her constant daytime companion was the Labrador Bailey May. She was considered a true member of the family. Matthew Speck, who was 37 at the time of the incident, had been living with Caitlin. Since early in their relationship, those who knew the couple described their life as steady. They owned property, they invested in home improvements, and they never aired their personal issues in public. Caitlin had been planning a major home renovation. She often chatted with friends about her interior ideas and spent time picking out design materials. She frequently said how much she enjoyed the peacefulness of suburban life and the freedom to work comfortably from home. Behind what seemed like a stable and happy home, close friends of Caitlin had begun to notice a troubling shift in Matthew's behavior. In the final years of their marriage, Caitlin confided in her inner circle about a growing emotional distance. According to her, Matthew was spending more time away from home and had become noticeably cold in their conversations. Still, Caitlin kept pouring energy and money into the life they had built. She wasn't seeking a separation. She hadn't looked for a new place to live. Everything inside Eagle Landing home had remained unchanged. Her design sketches were still laid out on the table. Building supplies she had purchased were stacked neatly in the garage, and her daily routine continued to revolve around Bailey May's care. This was Caitlin's safe space, if you will. Think of it as her sanctuary. What she did not know was that the rhythm of her life had already become the subject of calculated planning by the very person she shared that home and bed with. While medics tended to Matthew Speck's injuries, forensics teams got to work on the technical analysis of the Hannanan property. The investigators' first priority was to figure out how the alleged intruders had gotten in. But something didn't sit right. The perimeter showed no signs of forced entry. Every single access point was locked tight. The front door was secured with a deadbolt. The internal latch, all windows upstairs and down were unbroken. The frames were tightly sealed. Expensive laptops and other electronics were right where anyone would expect to find them. Not a single drawer had been pulled open. The clothes in the closet were untouched. On the kitchen floor and in the hallways were no footprints, no streaks of dirt, no evidence that someone had stormed through in a hurry or that a scuffle had taken place involving more than one person. The bedroom where Caitlin had been found was a sealed-off space. According to Matthew's account, the two men burst into the room, fired shots, wounded him, and fled. But the forensic breakdown told a different story. For anyone to have exited the house, they would have had to relock the deadbolt and latch it from the inside. It's an impossible move unless you're still in the house or you had keys. Investigators found no signs of lockpicks or spare keys being used in the mechanics of the doors or the windows, pointing to one undeniable fact. When the shots were fired, the only living beings inside that home were Caitlin, Matthew, and Bailey May. The concept of a break-in started to fall apart. There were no exit paths, no signs of movement beyond that room. The night the home in Eagle Landing had effectively become an airtight capsule, one that no one had left until law enforcement had arrived. At the hospital where Matthew Speck was taken, doctors and on-call detectives began a thorough examination of his injuries. Matthew claimed he sustained the wounds during a violent struggle with an armed intruder. But forensic specialists came to a different conclusion after closely analyzing the cuts on his arms and torso. The wounds were shallow with smooth edges, nothing like jagged or torn laceration typically seen when someone is fighting off wild knife strikes. There were no signs of defensive wounds at all. No deep gashes on the palms or the back of the hands, which usually appear when someone tries to grab a blade or shield their face. The expert labeled his injuries as a classic self-inflicted or hesitation marks. The placement of the cuts on his forearms in front of the abdomen were in areas easily reachable by the person himself. On top of that, bloodstains on Matthew's clothing suggested he had been standing still when the injuries occurred. In a real attack with movement and struggle, the blood pattern would have been completely different. Sprays, smears, and chaotic distribution. But what they found was clean, consistent, and controlled. Detectives took note of Matthew's odd behavior during evidence collection. His story about the alleged intruders, well, it kept changing. He couldn't keep their descriptions right. He kept messing up how tall they were and what clothes they were wearing. What stayed consistent, though, was his focus on his own pain. Medical reports confirmed that none of his wounds were life-threatening or required advanced surgical treatment. So basically, he was acting like a little bitch. The image of a brave fight for survival fell apart under the trained eyes of forensic experts. The second body found in the upstairs bedroom belonged to the family's golden Labrador, Bailey May. For the detectives, the loss of the dog became a critical piece in the puzzle in understanding the suspect's logic. Ballistics confirm that Bailey may have been shot with the same weapon used on Caitlin. The angle of the bullet suggested that the shot was fired at close range. The dog was lying in her usual spot by the bed. Her position indicated that she had not tried to attack or flee. She never even saw it coming, actually. The behavior of the family's Labrador that night became a crucial point against the theory of an outside intruder. Neighbors in the Eagle Landing community later confirmed that Bailey May had always been vocal around strangers, barking whenever anyone unfamiliar came to the gate or stepped into the hallway. But around 5 a.m. that morning, no one in the neighborhood reported hearing a single bark until after gunshots. This suggested that whoever moved through the house had entered the bedroom and was recognized by the dog. It was someone she knew, someone she did not see as a threat until it was too late. Even in death, Bailey May pointed investigators towards a chilling, dark truth. Whoever pulled the trigger was someone from inside her world. While Matthew Speck remained under medical observation, tech experts finished extracting data from his personal digital devices. His phone and computer were both seized from the Eagle Landing home and became kind of a black box, capturing the suspect's every move. In the days leading up to the event, according to cyber forensics reports, Matthew's online activity took a dark and specific turn in the days before the shooting. His browser history showed dozens of visits to pages related to toxicology and techniques for staging a criminal scene. Analysis confirmed that he wasn't just skimming articles. He had spent hours on specialized forums, reading detailed discussions, and gathering information on his phone. Screenshots were found showing maps with potential exit routes from the neighborhood, routes that could theoretically be used by someone trying to flee undetected. What stood out most to detectives was the timing. Those online searches, guess when they were happening? Late at night, while Caitlin was still in the next room. The simple existence of this kind of digital footprint on the phone of someone claiming a sudden home invasion became a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. But what truly unraveled Matthew's story wasn't just what he searched, but it was when he searched it. The timestamps on his activity directly contradicted his claims of a happy, committed marriage. To determine the motive, investigators broke the case down into two key areas: Matthew's personal relationship and his financial expectations. The most revealing testimony came from an ex-girlfriend, someone Matthew had reconnected with a few months before June 2020. She provided the detectives with messages in which Matthew plainly stated that his current marriage was nothing more than a formality. He needed to take care of it soon so he could start a new life with her. The second branch of the investigation led to one of Matthew Speck's co-workers. While his former girlfriend saw him as a romantic soul longing for his freedom, the colleague he worked with painted a very different picture, one of a calculated and pragmatic man. According to the co-worker, Matthew rarely complained about Caitlin as a person. But what really frustrated him were the legal complications around dividing the assets. He repeatedly emphasized that Caitlin would never agree to sell their home in Hanahan. For Matthew, a legal divorce meant losing the property he valued most and facing years of financial obligation. Suddenly, the pieces began to fall into place. Removing Caitlin would allow Matthew to keep the house, start a new life with someone else, and avoid the financial downfall a divorce would bring. It was a classic struggle between a clean slate and refusing to pay the legal price for it. Just hours after being discharged from the hospital, Matthew Speck found himself in the interrogation room. The detectives used a strategy known as logic traps. The detective asked one crucial question. Matthew, if you chased him, how did responding officers find the front door locked from the inside, and why was there no damage of any of the windows? Matthew had no real answer. He stumbled over his own timeline. First, he suggested that he might have locked the door himself in a state of shock. Then, wavering into a bizarre story, calling the intruders some kind of phantoms. The detectives presented the forensic reports on his wounds, the shallow nature of his cuts, the complete lack of gunpowder residue on his clothing, which is something you would absolutely expect if someone had fought a shooter at close range. This completely shattered his story, but the final blow came with the printouts. Detectives read to him his own search history, showing him how to fake a robbery, lethal doses of cyanide. When he was shown this, Matthew Speck went silent. The room fell into an uneasy stillness, a kind of unspoken admission. The airtight home, the surgical cuts, the disturbingly detailed browser history. There was no more room for talk of mysterious strangers or phantoms. Matthew Speck was placed under arrest. He never offered a real explanation for why his online searches mirrored the crime so precisely. Drawing from ballistic testing, blood spatter analysis, and digital evidence, investigators reconstructed the timeline of what really happened that night. The events didn't begin at 5 a.m., as Matthew had claimed. They began much earlier, in the darkness of the Eagle Landing neighborhood. Matthew waited until Caitlin was sound asleep. Then he retrieved the weapon that he had already prepped and loaded ahead of time. At that moment, the only ones inside the home were Caitlin Matthew and their dog, Bailey May. The first shots were fired in the upstairs bedroom. Caitlin was still in bed. She never had a chance to react. She made no defensive movements. Immediately after that, Matthew turned the weapon on Bailey May. The dog, who had shown no aggression toward her owner, was taken down where she lay. With the only living beings inside the house now gone, Matthew Speck moved on to execute the plan he had studied meticulously online. He walked from room to room, carefully staging what he wanted to look like a break-in, but even in his performance he was selective, avoiding damage to valuable electronics and the home's interior, which he clearly intended to keep. Once he finished setting the scene, Matthew went into the bedroom, using a sharp object, presumably a knife, later found bearing his DNA. He inflicted a series of shallow cuts on his arms and abdomen. He did this in front of a mirror, carefully controlling the depth of each wound, making sure not to hit any major arteries. Only after making sure he looked the part of a victim and waiting until daylight began to creep into the neighborhood did Matthew finally pick up his phone and call emergency services. The entire process, from first shot to the call, to the considerable time, which, explained by blood on both Caitlin and Dog, had already started to dry by the time the medical personnel had arrived. Every action Matthew took that night was calculated, aimed at building the illusion of an outside attack, while keeping himself safe behind locked doors. But in November 2024, the trial began in Berkeley County Court. Prosecutor Alexander Myers approached the case like a math problem, precise, structured, and undeniable. So instead of lengthy opening statements, he let the experts speak. A forensic pathologist demonstrated while Matthew's wounds could not have happened during a struggle. Those weren't marks from chaos, he told the jury. They were signs of planning. Ballistic experts backed up with scientific clarity the angle of the bullets, and the bedroom showed the shooter had been standing, still firing at the target who weren't moving. The shell casings found next to Caitlin and besides Bailey May matched exactly. The prosecutor emphasized that the person who fired these shots wasn't rushed. He operated in a sealed, empty home, fully aware that no one would interrupt him. That same day, testimony from Matthew's coworker and former girlfriend cemented the prosecution's case, for both the financial motive and the emotional tint were laid bare. The defense attempted to cast doubt by pointing to the poor quality of nearby security cameras, arguing that no footage proved there weren't intruders. But that point only strengthened the state's position. No one had entered or exited the home that night. After 5 days of intense testimony, the trial neared its conclusion. On the final day, the jury was reminded of the glaring contradiction at the heart of Matthew's story. His tale of chasing attackers through a house was physically locked from the inside. Deliberations did not take long for those who had seen the crime scene photos and the search of Matthew's history on his phone. The truth was crystal clear. When everyone returned to the courtroom, the silence was almost physical. Speck was found guilty on all counts: premeditated homicide, cruelty towards an animal, and an unlawful use of a firearm. Caitlin's mother and sister, seated quietly in the galley, received the verdict through silent tears. It wasn't a surprise, but it was the official confirmation that the man they had once welcomed as family was in the end her executioner. The judge agreed from the first internet search to the final call to the emergency services. Every step Matthew Speck took had been part of a calculated and cold-blooded plan. The final chapter of the Berkeley County Court case came with a sentencing that Judge Jefferson did not hold back at all. Matthew Speck was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. An additional 10 years were added, making it legally impossible for him to pursue early release based on good behavior. As of now, Matthew Speck is serving his term in South Carolina Correctional Facility. He is designated as without possibility of release. The fate of the Eagle Landing home, the silent motive behind the crime, was also sealed under state law. A person cannot benefit from their own offense. The property was transferred to Caitlin's heirs instead. This case will remain as a chilling reminder that in the age of forensics, perfect cover-ups don't exist. Caitlin Speck and Bailey May are now at peace, and their story reached an end, guided by facts that couldn't be locked behind any door.